Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history from rural Indiana. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The autumn of 1947 brought an unseasonable chill to Dubois County, Indiana, settling over the rolling farmland like a shroud that would never fully lift. The Rigsby family had purchased the old Hensley farmhouse that spring, drawn by its isolation and the promise of fertile soil stretching beyond the tree line toward the Patoka River bottoms. What they discovered in their basement that October would transform their understanding of human nature and force them to confront secrets that had festered in rural darkness for nearly 90 years. Thomas Rigsby, a veteran of the European theater, had returned from France carrying invisible wounds that manifested as a persistent need for silence and solitude. The farmhouse, situated 7 miles east of Jasper, along what locals called Mill Creek Road, offered the isolation he craved after witnessing the mechanized horrors of modern warfare. The nearest neighbor, Milton Hauser, lived nearly 2 miles away across fields of winter wheat, connected only by a dirt path that became impassable during heavy rains and spring floods. Eleanor Rigsby, Thomas's wife of 12 years, had supported the decision to leave their comfortable home in Evansville for this remote property. She understood her husband's need to escape the constant noise and crowds that had become unbearable since his return. The farmhouse promised peace, with its thick limestone walls and windows that looked out over empty fields rather than busy streets filled with automobiles and pedestrians. The basement had been sealed when they purchased the property from Ezra Hensley, an elderly man whose family had owned the land since before the Civil War. Hensley mentioned the sealed space only briefly during their single meeting, claiming the stone foundation had shifted over the decades and the basement was unsafe for habitation or storage. Eleanor later recalled that Hensley seemed unusually eager to complete the transaction, reducing his asking price twice during their conversation and accepting their offer immediately without the customary period of consideration. Ezra Hensley left Dubois County 3 days after the papers were signed, telling neighbors he planned to live with relatives in Ohio. No forwarding address was provided, and subsequent attempts to contact him regarding property maintenance issues proved futile. The local postmaster, Herman Goss, noted that Hensley had requested all mail be held at the post office indefinitely, claiming he was uncertain about his permanent address. Thomas began unsealing the basement in late October, working methodically each evening after completing his daily farm chores. Eleanor described his approach to the work as obsessive, measuring and planning each step with military precision. He spoke little during those weeks, communicating primarily through nods and brief gestures that reminded Eleanor of his behavior immediately after returning from overseas. The sealed entrance consisted of limestone blocks mortared together with unusual care, creating a barrier that appeared designed to last decades rather than provide temporary closure. Thomas noted that the mortar was old, but had been applied with professional skill, suggesting the work had been done by someone with extensive masonry experience. The blocks themselves bore chisel marks, indicating they had been cut specifically for this purpose rather than salvaged from other construction projects. Eleanor observed her husband's growing preoccupation with the basement project, noting that he often stood motionless before the sealed entrance for long periods, as though listening for sounds from within. His behavior reminded her of his wartime habit of freezing suddenly during normal activities, overwhelmed by memories or sensations that transported him back to combat zones. She began to worry that the isolation they had sought was affecting his mental state adversely. On November 3, 1947, Eleanor heard Thomas calling her name from the basement with an urgency that cut through the evening stillness like a blade. His voice carried a quality she had never heard before, even during his darkest moments after returning from Europe. The tone suggested discovery rather than distress, but underneath lay something that made her hesitate before responding to his summons. When Eleanor descended the narrow wooden stairs, she found Thomas standing motionless beneath the main support beam, holding an oil lamp high above his head. The flickering light cast dancing shadows across limestone walls that had been hidden for unknown years, revealing a space larger than they had expected. The air carried the musty scent of long isolation mixed with something else, something organic and unsettling, that seemed to emanate from the wooden beams overhead. The wooden beams throughout the basement bore names burned deeply into the oak, with what appeared to be a brand or heated iron rod. The names were not randomly placed, but arranged in precise rows, each accompanied by a date written in careful script. Eleanor counted 27 names in total, spanning from 1861 to 1923, creating a chronological record that suggested deliberate documentation rather than random graffiti or casual marking. The final entry read simply, Mary Catherine, followed by a date in March of 1923, nearly 25 years before the Rigsbys discovered the sealed chamber. The name had been burned with the same careful precision as the others, suggesting whoever had created this record had maintained their standards until the end. Below Mary Catherine's name, the wood showed scorch marks where additional text had begun but remained incomplete, as though the work had been interrupted suddenly. Thomas examined each name methodically, holding the lamp close to read the dates, while Eleanor remained near the stairs, fighting an inexplicable urge to flee the basement immediately. The names were predominantly female, though several male names appeared scattered throughout the chronological progression. Each entry included not only a name and date, but also brief notations in a script too small to read clearly in the lamplight. Eleanor noticed that the basement walls showed evidence of extensive modification over the years, with sections of newer limestone interspersed with original foundation stones. Tool marks on the wall suggested systematic excavation and reconstruction, creating alcoves and recesses that served no obvious structural purpose. The floor consisted of packed earth rather than stone, unusual for a foundation of this apparent age and quality. Thomas sealed the basement again that same evening, working by lamplight until nearly dawn with an urgency that seemed to consume all his attention. Eleanor helped him mix fresh mortar, though she later admitted she could not explain why she assisted without question or protest. They worked in complete silence, moving together with an efficiency that suggested unspoken understanding of the necessity for their actions. The mortar work proceeded with careful attention to matching the appearance of previous repairs, suggesting Thomas had studied the original construction techniques during his weeks of unsealing the space. He mixed the lime and sand in proportions that would cure to match the existing color and texture, creating a barrier that would appear undisturbed to casual observation. The final result looked exactly as it had when they first examined the sealed entrance months earlier. Eleanor later described the night of resealing as surreal, with both she and Thomas working as though compelled by forces beyond conscious decision. Neither questioned the necessity of concealing their discovery, despite having no clear understanding of why the basement should remain hidden. The burned names seemed to demand secrecy, though no explicit threat accompanied this compulsion. The local newspaper, the Dubois County Herald, carried no mention of unusual discoveries or activities at the former Hensley property. Editor William Morrison maintained detailed records of local news items, including property transfers, construction projects, and notable events affecting rural families. His files contain no references to the Rigsby farm beyond the routine property transfer announcement published in May of 1947. Church records from St. Joseph Parish, where the Rigsbys had attended Sunday services since moving to Dubois County, show their attendance ceased abruptly in November of 1947. Father McKenna noted in his private journal that Thomas Rigsby had visited him once during that period, requesting information about previous parishioners and families who had lived in their area of the county. Thomas left before receiving comprehensive answers, claiming he needed to return home for farm duties. Father McKenna's journal entries from November and December of 1947 reflect growing concern about the spiritual welfare of rural parishioners, particularly those living in isolated areas where contact with the broader community was limited. He noted several instances of families who had gradually withdrawn from church activities without explanation, creating patterns of absence that troubled him professionally and personally. Winter brought an isolation that extended far beyond the normal separation imposed by geography and weather. Eleanor's regular correspondence with her sister Margaret in Evansville ceased abruptly in December, ending a pattern of weekly letters that had continued uninterrupted since Eleanor's marriage 12 years earlier. Margaret's inquiries about Eleanor's sudden silence received no response, though her letters continued to arrive at the Rigsby farm throughout the winter months. The postal worker, Herman Goss, reported that mail addressed to the Rigsby farm began accumulating at the Jasper post office during the coldest months of winter. When Goss attempted delivery in January of 1948, traveling the difficult route despite hazardous road conditions, he found the front door secured with multiple heavy locks and received no response to his persistent knocking. Smoke rose from the chimney, indicating the house was occupied, but no amount of calling brought any acknowledgement of his presence. Goss noted in his delivery log that the Rigsby property showed signs of recent activity despite the apparent absence of the residents. Paths had been cleared through deep snow, connecting the house to the barn and other outbuildings with precision that suggested daily maintenance. Fresh wood had been stacked near the kitchen entrance, and the barn showed evidence of regular animal care, yet no one appeared when he announced his presence with increasing volume and persistence. County records indicate that Thomas Rigsby made frequent visits to the Dubois County Courthouse throughout the winter months, requesting access to property deeds, census records, death certificates, and other historical documents dating back to the 1860s. County Clerk Mrs. Patricia Wendell remembered his particular interest in the Hensley family lineage and the complete list of previous residents of his property, including temporary occupants and seasonal workers who might not appear in standard ownership records. Thomas carried a leather portfolio during these courthouse visits, filling it with handwritten copies of official documents and detailed notes about discrepancies between various records. Mrs. Wendell observed that he paid particular attention to death certificates and burial records, comparing dates and causes of death with census information and property transfer documents. His research method suggested legal training or professional investigation experience, though he never explained his background or the purpose of his inquiries. The courthouse research revealed several troubling patterns in the historical record surrounding the Hensley property. Death certificates for individuals known to have lived or worked on the farm often listed causes of death as accidental or natural. Yet witness statements and coroner reports contained details that seemed inconsistent with these official determinations. Missing person reports from neighboring counties occasionally mentioned individuals who had last been seen traveling toward the Hensley farm, though formal investigations had apparently concluded without resolution. In February of 1948, Thomas discovered additional documentation concealed within what appeared to be a secret compartment built into the basement wall structure. Eleanor described finding him seated at their kitchen table one morning, surrounded by yellowed papers, small leather-bound journals, and items that seemed to date from various periods spanning nearly a century. The discovery had apparently occurred during the night, though Thomas provided no explanation for his reasons for returning to the sealed basement. The concealed documents contained handwritten records that directly contradicted official county death certificates for several individuals whose names appeared burned into the basement beams. These alternative records included detailed descriptions of circumstances surrounding each death, along with notations about methods used for disposal of remains and precautions taken to avoid official scrutiny. The handwriting varied throughout the documents, indicating multiple authors across several decades of activity. Among the papers were detailed maps of the local area, marked with specific coordinates and symbols that corresponded to entries in the written records. The maps indicated numerous locations within a 5-mile radius of the Hensley property, each marked with symbols that appeared to represent burial sites, disposal areas, or other significant features related to the documented activities. Cross-referencing these locations with contemporary county records revealed several sites where unexplained discoveries had been reported over the years. The journals contained entries describing what the authors termed selection processes and detailed criteria for identifying suitable candidates among the local population. These criteria focused on individuals whose disappearance would attract minimal attention from law enforcement or family members. Particular attention was paid to transients, seasonal workers, elderly individuals without close family connections, and others whose absence might be attributed to natural causes or voluntary relocation. Eleanor's diary, discovered years later during an estate sale, documented her growing awareness of the implications of Thomas's discoveries. She described her husband's transformation from a troubled veteran seeking peace to someone consumed by the responsibility of maintaining secrets that extended far beyond their personal experience. The weight of this knowledge appeared to be crushing his spirit, while simultaneously compelling him to continue the research and documentation. The journals revealed that the basement served purposes beyond simple record-keeping, functioning as a central planning and preparation area for activities that had continued intermittently for nearly 90 years. Detailed descriptions of tools, techniques, and timing suggested a level of organization and systematic planning that challenged conventional understanding of isolated criminal behavior. The activities appeared to follow seasonal patterns, with increased activity during months when weather conditions favored concealment and disposal operations. Spring of 1948 brought no relief from the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over the Rigsby farmhouse like a permanent fog. Eleanor's diary entries from this period describe sounds emanating from the sealed basement despite its apparent emptiness, disturbances that occurred primarily during the hours between midnight and dawn. These sounds consisted of methodical scraping against stone, as though someone were attempting to carve additional markings into the walls or beams. The acoustic phenomena intensified during periods when atmospheric pressure dropped before major weather systems, suggesting that structural settling or natural causes might explain the disturbances. However, Eleanor noted that the sounds followed patterns too regular and purposeful to be attributed to random environmental factors. The scraping occurred in sequences that seemed to spell out letters or words, though she could never determine the complete messages being transmitted through the limestone and oak. Thomas began exhibiting behaviors that concerned even their most distant neighbors, who had respected his desire for privacy throughout the winter months. Milton Hauser, whose property bordered the Rigsby farm to the south, reported seeing Thomas walking the perimeter of his land during pre-dawn hours, carrying what appeared to be surveying equipment and making detailed measurements of distances between specific landmarks. When Hauser approached to offer assistance with whatever project Thomas was conducting, Thomas would retreat immediately without explanation. The surveying activities appeared to be related to the maps discovered in the basement compartment, with Thomas apparently verifying coordinates and updating information that had been recorded by previous residents. His nighttime excursions followed systematic patterns, suggesting he was conducting a comprehensive analysis of the entire area surrounding his property. Hauser noted that Thomas's surveying focused particularly on natural features that would provide concealment or access to underground areas. Dr. Edmund Fletcher, who served as Dubois County coroner from 1930 to 1952, maintained extensive private records that were donated to the Indiana State Archives following his death in 1968. Among these documents was a thick folder labeled Hensley Property Inquiries, containing correspondence between Fletcher and various law enforcement officials dating back to 1923. The letters referenced irregularities in reported causes of death and discrepancies between witness statements and physical evidence related to deaths occurring on or near the Hensley farm. Fletcher's notes indicated that members of the Hensley family had contacted him multiple times over the years regarding deaths that occurred on their property, seeking guidance on proper documentation procedures and legal requirements for reporting fatalities. The deaths, which occurred roughly every 3 to 4 years between 1861 and 1923, were consistently attributed to natural causes or accidents, despite what Fletcher privately described as circumstances that suggested alternative explanations. The coroner's files revealed a pattern of deaths that followed seasonal timing and demographic characteristics, matching the criteria outlined in the basement journals. Victims were typically individuals with limited family connections or social support systems, people whose disappearance could be explained through voluntary relocation or natural attrition rather than criminal activity. Fletcher noted that the Hensley family's cooperation with official investigations was exemplary, providing detailed explanations and supporting documentation for each incident. Fletcher had attempted to investigate the pattern of deaths more thoroughly during the early 1940s, but his inquiries were discouraged by county officials who viewed his concerns as unprofessional speculation rather than legitimate law enforcement issues. The lack of clear evidence linking the deaths beyond their geographical proximity and timing made formal investigation difficult to justify, particularly given the Hensley family's reputation for cooperation and community involvement. The breakthrough in understanding came when Eleanor discovered that one of the basement journals contained detailed instructions for maintaining official credibility while conducting systematic elimination of selected individuals. The instructions emphasized the importance of establishing cooperative relationships with local authorities, providing reasonable explanations for unusual events, and maintaining documentation that would satisfy official requirements while concealing the true nature of activities. Thomas's behavior during late spring of 1948 suggested that he felt compelled to continue the activities documented in the journals rather than simply preserve the historical record. Eleanor's diary describes finding Thomas seated in the basement for hours, reading the journals by lamplight and making notations in margins that appeared to represent his own plans and preparations. His research had evolved from historical curiosity to active planning for future activities. The final entry in Thomas Rigsby's own journal, begun during the winter research period, was dated June 15, 1948. This entry contained detailed confessions regarding his intentions for continuing what the previous authors had termed the maintenance of order in the rural community. Thomas expressed gratitude for what he considered divine guidance in revealing the basement's contents and his responsibility for continuing the work begun by previous generations. The journal entry concluded with a list of names selected from the surrounding community, each accompanied by planned dates for processing extending through the following winter months. The selection criteria matched those outlined in the historical documents, focusing on individuals whose absence would be easily explained and whose disappearance would not trigger intensive investigation. Thomas had apparently spent months identifying suitable candidates and developing operational plans. Eleanor Rigsby disappeared on June 20, 1948, 5 days after Thomas completed his planning journal. According to Thomas's statement to authorities, Eleanor had expressed interest in exploring the Mill Creek area to search for wild herbs and medicinal plants that grew along the water's edge. She had left the house early in the morning carrying a wicker basket and had not returned by evening, leading Thomas to assume she had lost track of time or encountered difficulty navigating the creek-bottom terrain. Eleanor's body was discovered 3 days later by a search party organized by Milton Hauser and other concerned neighbors. She was found in Mill Creek, approximately 1 mile downstream from the Rigsby property, caught among fallen trees that had created a natural dam. The official cause of death was listed as accidental drowning, with the assumption that Eleanor had slipped on wet rocks and been unable to escape the current during a period of elevated water levels following recent rainfall. Dr. Fletcher conducted the autopsy examination and privately noted several inconsistencies between the condition of Eleanor's remains and the official explanation of accidental drowning. His notes, contained in files that remained classified for decades, indicated that Eleanor's injuries were more consistent with blunt force trauma than drowning, and that the estimated time of death preceded her reported disappearance by approximately 12 hours. Fletcher's attempts to discuss these discrepancies with investigating officials were dismissed as technical complications that did not affect the clear evidence of accidental death. Thomas Rigsby provided detailed statements to County Sheriff Douglas Kemp regarding Eleanor's disappearance and his own activities during the relevant time period. His account emphasized Eleanor's interest in natural remedies and her familiarity with the creek area, suggesting that her decision to explore alone was consistent with her personality and interests. Thomas expressed appropriate grief and confusion about the tragedy while cooperating fully with official inquiries. Following Eleanor's death, Thomas sealed himself within the farmhouse for the remainder of the summer, maintaining minimal contact with neighbors and conducting all necessary business through written correspondence or brief conversations during supply trips to Jasper. Milton Hauser reported seeing smoke from the Rigsby chimney during even the hottest days of summer, suggesting continuous fires despite outdoor temperatures that made indoor heating uncomfortable and unnecessary. The smoke that rose from the Rigsby chimney during the summer months carried what several neighbors described as an unusual odor, distinctly different from burning wood or coal. The scent was reminiscent of burning bone or organic material rather than normal fuel sources, creating an acrid atmosphere that lingered over the property even when wind conditions should have dispersed the smoke quickly. No official investigation of these observations was conducted, as Thomas continued to appear in public occasionally and maintained sufficient contact to avoid raising official concerns about his welfare. In August of 1948, 3 individuals from the surrounding rural community were reported missing within a span of 2 weeks, creating a pattern of disappearances that exceeded normal statistical expectations for the area. Margaret Kohler, who operated a small general store in nearby Ferdinand, was last seen making her regular supply delivery to the Rigsby farm on August 7th. Her wagon was found abandoned along Mill Creek Road, approximately halfway between Ferdinand and the Rigsby property, with no indication of why she had stopped or what had become of her after abandoning the vehicle. James Morrison, a traveling salesman from Jasper who specialized in farm equipment and household goods, had marked the Rigsby property on his route schedule for August 14th. Morrison was an experienced traveler who knew the rural roads well and maintained regular contact with his employer through written reports submitted at weekly intervals. His failure to return to Jasper or submit his weekly report triggered inquiries that revealed he had reached several properties on his planned route, but had never arrived at the Rigsby farm. Sarah Blanchard, a widow who provided housekeeping and cooking services to rural families throughout Dubois County, was scheduled to begin working for Thomas Rigsby on August 21st. Sarah had contacted Thomas through a written advertisement placed in the Ferdinand General Store, seeking domestic employment to support herself following her husband's death in a farming accident earlier that year. She had visited the Rigsby property once for an initial interview and had agreed to begin regular work the following week, but never returned for her first day of employment. The pattern of disappearances attracted attention from County Sheriff Douglas Kemp, who had known all three missing individuals personally and considered their simultaneous absence highly unusual. Kemp conducted informal inquiries among neighbors and business associates, attempting to identify common factors that might explain why three reliable, experienced individuals would disappear without explanation within such a short time period. The only apparent connection between the missing persons was their association with the Rigsby property. Kemp visited the Rigsby farm in early September, following pressure from concerned family members and community leaders who demanded official investigation of the disappearances. His report, filed with the state police according to standard protocols for major criminal investigations, described Thomas Rigsby as cooperative and forthcoming about his interactions with each missing individual. However, Kemp noted several inconsistencies in Thomas's statements and observed evidence of recent construction activities on the property. The sheriff's report specifically mentioned that the basement access had been sealed with fresh mortar that appeared much newer than other masonry work on the property. When questioned about recent construction, Thomas became noticeably agitated and provided vague explanations about foundation maintenance and structural repairs. His behavior suggested knowledge that he was reluctant to share, though Kemp lacked sufficient evidence to justify more aggressive investigation techniques. Dr. Fletcher's private correspondence from September 1948 reveals his growing conviction that the pattern of disappearances was connected to historical activities at the Hensley property. In a detailed letter to Indiana State Police Detective Robert Callahan, Fletcher outlined his concerns about the correlation between recent events and documented patterns extending back to the 1860s. He requested formal state investigation based on the accumulated evidence of systematic criminal activity, but was informed that state resources could not be allocated without more concrete evidence of criminal wrongdoing. Detective Callahan, though unable to justify official state intervention, maintained personal interest in the case and conducted unofficial inquiries during his off-duty hours. Callahan had developed expertise in recognizing patterns of criminal behavior that extended across long time periods, and Fletcher's documentation triggered his professional instincts about systematic predatory activity. His personal files, discovered after his death in 1964, contained extensive notes on the Rigsby case and similar patterns he had identified in other rural areas. Callahan's unofficial investigation included visits to neighboring counties where he inquired about missing persons cases and unexplained deaths that might be connected to the Dubois County disappearances. His research revealed several properties in adjoining areas that had histories remarkably similar to the Hensley farm, including patterns of deaths and disappearances spanning multiple generations and involving families who maintained extensive records of their activities. The detective's notes indicate that he personally visited the Rigsby farm on 3 separate occasions during October 1948, each time claiming to conduct routine welfare checks on behalf of concerned citizens. During these visits, Callahan observed that the basement access had been unsealed and resealed multiple times, evidenced by variations in mortar color and texture that suggested recent and frequent disturbance of the barrier. Callahan also documented the presence of what appeared to be fresh excavation sites around the perimeter of the Rigsby property, including several areas where soil had been disturbed and replaced with insufficient skill to conceal the activity from experienced observation. His notes suggest that Thomas was actively engaged in burial operations rather than simply maintaining historical records, indicating that the pattern of criminal activity was continuing under new management. The end came suddenly in late October 1948, terminating both Thomas's activities and the official investigation before complete documentation could be achieved. Thomas Rigsby was found dead by Milton Hauser, who had grown concerned about the absence of smoke from the farmhouse chimney during a period of cold weather that normally would have required continuous heating. Hauser's discovery occurred on October 28th, exactly 1 year after Thomas had first unsealed the basement. Thomas was discovered in the basement, seated beneath the beam bearing the burned names, holding an extinguished oil lamp in hands that showed no signs of struggle or distress. The basement had been unsealed again, and the walls showed evidence of recent modification, including additional alcoves and storage areas that had not been present during Callahan's earlier observations. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, though Dr. Fletcher noted that Thomas showed no signs of cardiac distress and appeared to have simply ceased breathing while engaged in contemplation of the burned names. The basement examination following Thomas's death revealed extensive modifications to the original structure, including the installation of additional support beams that bore fresh burn marks where new names had been carefully added. The names of Margaret Kohler, James Morrison, and Sarah Blanchard appeared prominently on the newest beam, along with Eleanor Rigsby's name and the date of her death. At the bottom of this beam, Thomas had burned his own name, accompanied by the date of his discovery of the basement contents. Dr. Fletcher's final report on the Rigsby case, submitted to county authorities but sealed from public access, recommended that the basement be permanently sealed and the property condemned due to what he officially described as structural instability. His private notes, however, revealed concerns about what he characterized as psychological contamination, affecting anyone who spent extended time within the basement space. Fletcher theorized that prolonged exposure to the environment and its contents created mental states that compelled continued participation in the documented activities. The property was eventually sold to Dubois County for unpaid taxes following extensive legal proceedings that attracted no public attention due to administrative efficiency and deliberate discretion. The land was later incorporated into what became the Patoka River National Wildlife Refuge, ensuring permanent federal oversight and restricted public access. This designation effectively ended any possibility of private development or investigation that might reveal additional evidence of past activities. Detective Callahan's unofficial investigation concluded with a comprehensive theory that was never formally presented but remained in his personal files for potential future reference. Callahan theorized that the Rigsby farm had served as the operational center for systematic targeting and elimination of isolated individuals over a period spanning nearly 90 years. The burned names represented a complete record of victims, maintained by successive property owners who had discovered the basement contents and chosen to continue rather than expose the historical pattern. Callahan's theory suggested that the isolation of the property, combined with detailed operational records and selection criteria, created a self-perpetuating system that transmitted knowledge and methodology across generations of participants. The systematic nature of the activities indicated organizational sophistication that extended beyond individual psychological pathology, suggesting coordination between multiple properties and families involved in similar operations throughout rural Indiana and neighboring states. The 3 individuals who disappeared in August 1948 were never located, despite extensive searches of the property and surrounding areas conducted by state police and federal investigators. Ground-penetrating radar surveys performed in 1951 as part of geological studies detected multiple anomalies beneath the basement floor and throughout the property grounds, but excavation was deemed unsafe due to foundation concerns and potential environmental hazards. The radar surveys were immediately classified under federal security provisions and became part of a larger collection of documents related to rural criminal activities that required specialized investigation techniques and resources. Access to these materials was restricted to federal investigators with appropriate security clearances and documented need for the information in connection with active criminal investigations. Psychiatric evaluations conducted on Dr. Fletcher during the 1950s revealed persistent trauma related to his involvement with the Rigsby case and similar investigations throughout his career as county coroner. Fletcher described recurring nightmares involving the sound of names being burned into wood and expressed persistent conviction that the pattern of activities would eventually resume in other locations. His detailed documentation of comparable cases throughout rural Indiana suggested networks of coordinated criminal activity that extended far beyond individual properties or families. Fletcher's recommendations for systematic investigation of rural properties with histories similar to the Rigsby farm were never implemented by state or federal authorities, ostensibly due to resource limitations and jurisdictional complications. However, his documentation provided the foundation for federal monitoring programs that operated without public acknowledgement and focused on identifying and tracking potential continuation of systematic predatory activities in rural communities. The Rigsby farmhouse was demolished in 1954 as part of wildlife refuge development, but the basement structure remained intact due to engineering concerns about potential ground subsidence and contamination issues that might affect surrounding areas. A reinforced concrete cap was installed over the entire basement opening, and the immediate area was designated as environmentally sensitive habitat that required federal permits for any disturbance or research activities. Park records maintained by the National Wildlife Refuge System indicate that unauthorized excavation attempts have occurred periodically throughout the decades since the property was placed under federal protection. These incidents are handled quietly through administrative channels to avoid attracting public attention to the site or its history. Individuals apprehended during unauthorized access attempts are typically charged with minor environmental violations rather than more serious offenses that might require detailed legal proceedings. Local folklore surrounding the former Rigsby property persists among longtime residents of Dubois County, though official sources consistently discourage public discussion of historical events related to the site. The names Thomas and Eleanor Rigsby appear on no memorial markers or historical displays in the area, and county historical societies have been advised to focus public presentations on more positive aspects of local heritage and development. Case files related to the Rigsby farm investigation were consolidated and transferred to federal archives in 1968 under provisions related to ongoing criminal investigations and national security considerations. The files remain classified with access requiring federal security clearance and documented research purposes related to law enforcement activities. Multiple requests for declassification submitted by academic researchers have been denied based on concerns about compromising investigative techniques and sources related to cases that may still be active. Recent developments in rural crime investigation have brought renewed federal attention to patterns similar to those documented at the Rigsby farm. Properties in neighboring states have exhibited comparable histories of systematic disappearances and detailed record-keeping by successive owners, suggesting that the activities may have represented part of a broader network rather than isolated incidents. Federal investigators maintain officially that these cases are unconnected, though similarities in methodology and documentation suggest coordinated activities spanning multiple generations and geographical areas. The final entry in Detective Callahan's case files, written shortly before his death from natural causes in 1964, expressed profound regret about the decision to close the Rigsby investigation without achieving complete resolution of the disappearances. Callahan noted that the systematic nature of the activities represented a form of organized predatory behavior that exploited the isolation and vulnerability of rural communities where official law enforcement resources were limited and community oversight was minimal. Callahan's concern that similar activities might continue in other locations proved to be prescient. Though official acknowledgement of connections between related cases remains unlikely due to jurisdictional complications and resource limitations that affect coordination between local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies. His documentation provides a model for identifying systematic predatory patterns that might otherwise be dismissed as unrelated incidents or natural attrition in rural populations. The concrete cap installed over the Rigsby basement was found severely cracked during a routine environmental inspection in 1962, with damage patterns suggesting deliberate disturbance rather than natural deterioration from weather or geological settling. Emergency repair work revealed that the original burn markings on the basement beams had been perfectly preserved by the sealed environment, remaining clearly visible despite the passage of 15 years since their discovery. Photographs were taken during the 1962 repair operation for documentation purposes, though these images were immediately classified under federal security provisions and have never been made available for academic or historical research. The photographs reportedly show not only the original burned names, but also additional markings that had been added during Thomas Rigsby's final months, including detailed plans for future activities and maps showing locations throughout the surrounding area. Contemporary visitors to Patoka River National Wildlife Refuge report persistent acoustic phenomena in the area where the Rigsby farmhouse once stood, describing sounds reminiscent of methodical scraping against stone that occur primarily during pre-dawn hours, when atmospheric conditions favor sound transmission over long distances. Park rangers attribute these reports to wildlife activity and natural settling of underground structures, though the consistency of witness descriptions suggests more specific origins for the disturbances. Scientific studies of the acoustic phenomena have been conducted discreetly by federal researchers, though results of these investigations remain classified under provisions related to ongoing law enforcement activities. The studies reportedly confirmed that sounds originating from the sealed basement area follow patterns too regular and purposeful to be attributed to random environmental factors or animal behavior. The legacy of the Rigsby farm extends far beyond its immediate geographical boundaries through the extensive documentation maintained by various officials who encountered the case during their professional activities. These records, scattered across multiple archives and private collections, preserve details that might otherwise have been lost to deliberate obscuration or administrative oversight. The persistence of these materials ensures that the complete pattern of events remains accessible to federal investigators with appropriate security clearances and documented need for the information. Environmental studies conducted throughout the former Rigsby property during the 1970s detected soil anomalies consistent with the systematic burial of organic material over extended time periods. The studies were conducted as part of routine wildlife habitat assessment and were not specifically related to criminal investigation, though the findings provided scientific corroboration for theories about the property's use for disposing of evidence related to systematic criminal activities. The environmental studies remain in restricted federal archives, accessible only through protocols established for sensitive law enforcement research. The data reportedly indicates burial sites extending far beyond the immediate basement area, suggesting that the documented activities involved larger numbers of victims than indicated by the burned names alone. Contemporary criminal investigation techniques applied retrospectively to the Rigsby case have provided insights into systematic predatory behavior that operates across extended time periods and multiple generations of participants. The case has become a reference point for federal training programs that focus on recognizing and investigating organized criminal activities in rural environments where traditional law enforcement approaches may prove inadequate. Modern psychological analysis of the available documentation suggests that the Rigsby farm represented a unique form of organized criminal behavior that combined elements of systematic predation, ritual documentation, and intergenerational transmission of methods and knowledge. The psychological profiles developed from study of the case have contributed to federal protocols for identifying and monitoring similar activities in other rural communities. The transformation of the former Rigsby property into protected wildlife habitat created an ironic memorial to the documented events while serving practical law enforcement purposes by maintaining federal control over access to potentially sensitive evidence. The Wildlife Refuge designation ensures that the land will remain undisturbed indefinitely while preventing development or private ownership that might compromise ongoing federal oversight of the site. Questions about the ultimate fate of the individuals whose names were burned into the basement beams remain officially unanswered. Though federal investigators have developed theories based on analysis of soil samples, ground-penetrating radar data, and other scientific evidence collected over several decades of discrete monitoring, the lack of recovered remains suggests either highly sophisticated disposal methods or burial sites located beyond the immediate property boundaries in areas that have not yet been surveyed comprehensively. The case continues to influence federal approaches to investigating organized criminal activities that operate in rural environments, particularly those involving systematic targeting of vulnerable populations over extended time periods. Training materials developed for federal agents include detailed scenarios based on the Rigsby case, emphasizing the importance of recognizing patterns that might span decades or generations before being detected by conventional law enforcement methods. Dr. Fletcher's final assessment of the case, completed shortly before his retirement from the coroner's position, characterized the events at the Rigsby farm as representing a form of institutionalized criminal behavior that functioned through deliberate exploitation of social isolation, official indifference, and community reluctance to investigate thoroughly activities that occurred within supposedly respectable families. His analysis identified factors that enabled the systematic activities to continue for nearly 90 years before being interrupted by circumstances beyond the participants' control. The documentation preserved from the Rigsby case serves as a permanent reference point for understanding how systematic criminal behavior can persist across generations when supported by favorable geographical, social, and institutional conditions. The combination of rural isolation, historical precedent, community acceptance of privacy norms, and limited law enforcement resources created an environment that enabled organized predatory activities to continue virtually undetected for nearly a century. Academic interest in the case has been systematically discouraged through administrative mechanisms that include restriction of archive access, classification of research materials, and indirect pressure applied to researchers who persist in studying the documented events. These obstacles ensure that public awareness of the case remains limited while preserving complete documentation for potential use by federal investigators in connection with related cases that may develop in other locations. The psychological impact of direct involvement with the Rigsby case has been documented through medical records and personal correspondence maintained in various federal archives. The consistent pattern of persistent psychological trauma among individuals who were exposed to complete documentation of the activities suggests effects that extend beyond those normally associated with criminal investigation or routine law enforcement duties. Contemporary federal officials with knowledge of the case express private concern about the possibility that similar operations may continue in other rural locations where geographical and social conditions remain favorable for systematic predatory activities. The organizational sophistication demonstrated by the Rigsby farm operations suggests coordination and planning capabilities that extend far beyond individual psychological pathology or spontaneous criminal behavior. The final assessment of the Rigsby case remains incomplete due to ongoing classification of critical documents and a continued restriction of access to physical evidence collected at the site. The available materials provide sufficient detail to understand the general pattern of systematic criminal activities, while leaving fundamental questions about organization, coordination, and geographic extent unresolved. This incomplete knowledge serves the practical purpose of maintaining public tranquility while preserving investigative options for federal authorities who may encounter related activities in other jurisdictions. The transformation of extraordinary criminal behavior into routine administrative procedure represents perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Rigsby case legacy for those federal officials who maintain knowledge of the complete documentation. The systematic processing and official management of evidence related to nearly 90 years of organized predatory activities demonstrates institutional capacity for absorbing and normalizing extreme criminal behavior while maintaining operational secrecy and public confidence in rural safety. The concrete cap over the Rigsby basement remains in place today, marked only by a small federal monitoring device that records seismic activity and environmental changes in the surrounding area. Wildlife refuge visitors pass within yards of the site without awareness of what lies beneath the earth, protected by administrative efficiency, federal oversight, and the accumulated weight of bureaucratic silence that has settled over the documented events like sediment accumulating in still water. The burned names wait in perpetual darkness below the concrete barrier preserved indefinitely by federal protection and environmental controls that maintain constant temperature and humidity levels within the sealed space. The names serve as permanent witnesses to systematic criminal activities that spanned nearly 90 years, though their testimony remains accessible only to federal investigators with appropriate security clearances and documented need for information related to ongoing law enforcement activities. Modern visitors to Dubois County who inquire about local history receive information about agricultural development, natural resources, and community achievements that shape the area's growth and prosperity. The Rigsby farm is not mentioned in official historical presentations, and local residents who remember the events have been advised that discussion of classified federal investigations could compromise ongoing law enforcement activities and community safety. The silence that protects contemporary rural communities from knowledge of the documented activities also ensures that similar patterns of systematic criminal behavior could develop elsewhere, without triggering recognition based on historical precedent. This paradox reflects the complex balance between public safety, investigative effectiveness, and community confidence that guides federal policy regarding cases that involve extended criminal activities in rural environments where detection and prevention remain challenging due to geographical and social factors beyond conventional law enforcement control.